Volume 2 of the Underdogs Rise, edited by J.R. Martin, is now available on Amazon and features my story, The Agony of Anticipation. I'll read you just a little bit. Black grit coated the back of the demon's throat when the weak winter sun tugged them from sleep. The first moment of consciousness, as always, was deeply uncomfortable. The awful nothingness of air rather than water against their skin. The poor substitute of a canvas bedsheet for the sand and silt and stones of a riverbed against their aching flesh. The unbearable weight of their bones in their body, creaking and groaning as if they would break. Gangara moaned, still unwilling to raise their eyelids. Melodramatic, maybe, but they had no one to impress with a stoic greeting to the day, and they'd never yet known a morning to improve with false cheer. They rolled over, sliding off the bed into a heap on the floor that offered no measurable advantage to productivity than the heap they'd been in the bed. The difference, though, as long experience had taught them, was that the floor, being even more unpleasant to lie on, provided sufficient motivation to forced function. So with a long sigh and another moan, Gangara rose from the floor and drifted to the attic window to glare out at the day. Day glared back, unmoved. Gray. Of course. The city was always gray now. Once upon a time it had been only mostly gray, but that was decades gone. Wet gusts of filthy air laden with particulates gusted between skyscrapers and cathedrals and down streets of asphalt and cobblestone. An endless rubble of dissatisfaction and misery and desperation rose from the huddled bunches of people and transports down below. Grimy frost ringed the window, its crystals a cruel parody of beauty. In winter, at least, the tiny attic flat had its compensations. What meager heat the residents on lower floors could manage rose here, and kept Gangara more comfortable than most. Summer, though, was its own kind of hell. No matter how long they stood there, though, Gangara couldn't convince themselves that today was just an ordinary day like any other. That black grit in their throat compounded and grew, and as much as they swallowed, they couldn't quite rid themselves of the sensation of choking. Their belly hardened, growing heavier and heavier. No use putting it off. They strapped on their gear in automatic effort, though any serious altercations were unlikely. Most of the time, mortals couldn't even see them, and when they did, it was as more of a shadow than a being. Demons weren't invisible. Far from it. Mortals were just apathetic. Though on days like this, Gangara preferred the term stupid. Distracted and consumed by themselves and their devices, mortals were oblivious to most everything, even their own imminent demises. But there was something comforting and ritual in the pretense that Gangara still had a purpose in this twilight of the eon. So they gathered up all their trappings and left the garret behind, drifting down the dim, grim stairwell like a creeping black mold. 10 blocks over, through a derelict park that managed to be both overgrown and undergrown, past a huddle of sleeping homeless in an unmaintained public bathroom, and down into the catacombs. Such a relief to be here again. The air was stale but cleaner than above ground, cool but not cold, with no cruel wind or sleeting rain. And the people here were different too. Demons and exiled angels and the fae, but no ordinary mortals. Because of course fae were mortal, but they'd changed, hadn't they? Some for the worse, some for the better. Most had been soldiers in their other lives, though there were variations on that theme. All of them had been killers by trade. Just being mortal was strange enough an idea to Gangara. The notion of then leveraging that massive weakness as a means of robbing other mortals of their few brief hours, at the behest of a rich man none of them knew, for the sake of redrawing an imaginary line on land they'd never own, was downright bizarre. And apparently, that sort of irrationality carried its own consequences. Those veterans of combat who roamed the city above, and who were the only mortals welcome here in the ether world, possessed a peculiar cadre of gifts varied and mysterious and weighty in their costs. The Fae tended to wink out pretty quickly, much faster than a normal mortal lifespan, and they didn't usually go quietly. It was just one such Fae Gangara was meeting today. Futilely, they wished they'd never gotten attached to the Fae. They supposed it was like the predilection mortals used to have for dogs before they'd needed them for meat. Back in the good old days when the world was a little cooler and there'd been plenty of food to go around. It hadn't gone around, naturally, because some people always wanted more than they needed, but at least theoretically it had been possible to feed the world back then. Now huge swaths of people died off every day of starvation. Gangara still remembered, though, how sweet and silly they had found it when mortals made friends with those four-legged creatures. How they would weep, bereft, when in just a few years their friends died. And then those baffling mortals had turned around and done it all over again. Gangara had managed to avoid such entanglements for a good long while, but lately they'd succumbed. And while on most days they were able to push aside the fear of impending and unavoidable grief, on the third day of the second week of every month, they woke up with black grit in their throat and hot smelt in their belly. Would Taika be there this time? Would she have persisted through her immeasurable despair? Would she have resisted the pull of her powers toward one last grand gesture? Or would the table be empty? Would every day after be defined by her absence, every hour limned with what wasn't and would not be again? Gangara's steps slowed as they neared the cavernous saloon with no name. What if she didn't show? What if they never showed again? Then Taika not being in their life wouldn't be a loss or a void, it'd be a choice. Their choice. They could turn around now, and in their mind, in all possibility, Taika would always be alive. Maybe even always be waiting on them, instead of the other way around. But want is a funny thing, especially when almost all wants have been stolen away by needs. However slim and nebulous the lure, the hook stuck. Gangara couldn't turn around. Not when Taika might be steps away. However agonizingly slow, Gangara's feet carried them inexorably into the dark, smoky, crowded room, awash with music and laughter and stomping boots. Their gaze went unerringly to their table, and their heart stopped. No Taika. Balthus was there, though, as he always was. The craggy-faced gargoyle, his stone broadly pocked with green moss, waved them over. Gangara crossed the room and lowered themselves painfully onto a chair. "Don't look like that, love," Balthus said. "She's coming, don't you worry. She's just a mite late. Or we're a mite early. She'll be here." Gangara couldn't summon a response that wasn't rude, so instead they waved a server over. "Triple," they ordered briskly. The bar with no name only ever served one spirit, and nobody knew exactly what it was. Besides strong. Everyone knew it was strong. Balthus looked at them so sympathetically they bared their teeth and hissed. "Don't be nice to me," they snapped. "Wouldn't dream of it," Balthus agreed. "You look like shit, by the way. How long has it been since you've made it to a waterway?" Ugh. Gangara shoved an imaginary pair of sunglasses higher up on their face. Too long. I know I need to, but it's depressing, you know? The rivers are so shallow, they're basically creeks, and they're filthy. Choked. I almost feel worse after I've been instead of better. Balthus' lumpy eyebrows creased in an effect rather more comical than consternated. At some point, you'll have to leave the city. Head up into the mountains. Life here isn't sustainable for a river demon. And I don't know that the mortals left here are even worth fighting anymore. They're little more than ghosts themselves. The people with all the power are out of reach. Gangara didn't even let the server set their drink down. They snatched it right out of his hand and drank half of it in a gulp. I'll need another, they told the wide-eyed pixie, who scampered away with alacrity. Maybe, they conceded, wiping their hand with the back of their mouth. Wiping their mouth with the back of their hand. Or maybe I'm supposed to just evaporate when the river does. I didn't always have this form, or this purpose. Maybe another change is coming. Gangara tried not to think about what they had been. There was no point, was there? Why regret what you couldn't change and what you'd had no control over in the first place? Why miss what you could never have back? Sometimes when they slept, though, they still dreamed of the past. Back when rivers were still clear, when salmon still spawned, when the earth wasn't choking to death on its own dust, even while billowing tides of salt water rose higher and higher. Back when river demons were still naiads. Back when it was their job to shepherd all the multitudinous life of the fresh waterways, from algae to bacteria to fish to dragonflies to kingfishers. Now, they were all darkness, through and through. And the only task that still remained to them was to drown fisherfolk and poison the heedless. Gangara stretched out their hands and looked at them before finishing off their drink. They swore they could hear the pixie gulping as he swooped back by just in time and set down another triple. Balthus shook his head. That's mortal talk. We immortals don't get the luxury of giving up. If change is coming, it's a change of location. Headwaters, I'm telling you. That's where you need to be. Gangara fluttered their stubby lashes. You'd miss me, they said. The truth was, the thought of leaving the city, leaving the Rhone, leaving Balthus, made them sick to their stomach. They'd been lonely before. They didn't want to be lonely again. Once upon a time, this city, for all its wild, wicked, reckless ways, had been a magical place. Besides, I'm tired, Balthus. Really tired. Would it be so bad to just drift up into the clouds and not come back down? Balthus scowled. Yes, it would. And you're so tired because you need to hie thee to a waterway already. All this giving up talk stinks of Taika and her maudlin mortal mulings. And speak of the devil. Gangara's whole form reverberated as Taika slid into the chair beside them with a clatter. The black grit in the back of their throat vanishing in a gush of sweet relief. They had to calm down, they thought. They were shaking like a gust of wind. Sorry, Taika said, though her wide grin offered no remorse. She leaned close to the table and opened her jacket. Gangara caught a glimpse of something, several somethings, mechanical and scary looking in a way that only humans could master. Had to pick up some supplies. Hey, why didn't you order a drink for me? With a waggle of her eyebrows, she snatched up Gangara's second drink before they could protest and downed it. She waved the beleaguered pixie over with a yell. 3 more! We're drinking on me tonight. We're drinking to me. Gangara tried to focus on what Taika was saying, but they felt positively lightheaded. Joy, they thought muddily, this. This is joy. That rush of elation, this momentary abatement of the weight that hourly increased the density of her bones, was what they lived for 29 days and 24 hours out of the month. There was no point denying that anymore, was there? Balthus was not suffering from a paradigm shift, and his focus worked just fine. What the hell are those? I know I'm not going to like the answer, but give it to me anyway. Tycha's glowing, Gangara thought. She'd been fair once, and probably rather beautiful back when she first put on a uniform. Now Tycha's skin was a perpetually shifting array of mottled, stippled bruises in varying shades of green, purple, blue, and yellow. The whites of her eyes glowed red beneath a shock of once white blonde hair, now a dingy lavender. Her phantom limb, all that remained of the leg shattered by a mine, flashed in and out of phase. That, more than anything, tormented Tycha, Gangara knew. Sometimes it was as solid and corporeal as the table at which they were sitting. But there was never any warning when it would phase out, so she relied heavily on her cane. The agony, though, was constant, whether in phase or not. The last 3 months they'd met, Tycha had been as grim as Gangara had ever seen her. And while Gangara tended to avoid the Fae, she knew their tendencies well enough. Everyone did. None of the Fae were long for this world. And once they took on that look, it was only a matter of time before they sputtered out. But tonight, Tycha was glowing, grinning, her eyes alight, her good leg tapping. She waited until their drinks arrived before gesturing to Balthus and Gangara to huddle close. They're finally coming to port, tonight. After all this time, I didn't think I'd make it, but they're coming in. Who? Asked Gangara thickly.